My name is Ken Malcolmson, and as the CEO of the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, I have the privilege of welcoming you to this incredible event, our annual Energy Forum. As much as we'd like to be in person, we think that this Remo platform that we're offering as one of our three service platforms today is best replicating a networking environment in a hotel ballroom. So thank you again for your involvement today, your participation, and your attendance. We're looking forward to a very engaging program with two of our favorite partners here at the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, Rob Kaplan and Todd Staples. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our official welcomer, and I think it's important to note that Tina Young is our incoming board chair. Her tenure begins on Monday, since our fiscal year ends on January 31st. And Tina is the founder and CEO of MarketWave, and she also is a longtime board member of the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce and actively engaged in the community in so many different ways. And we're so pleased to have Tina not only be our official welcome person today, but also we're so pleased to have her as our chair. I would be remiss if I did not recognize real quickly our current board chair, since this is the last day of our fiscal year. And Charles Elk is with Encore, and he has just done a fantastic job during a very challenging year in leading our chamber, and we can't thank him enough for all of his efforts during the past year. Charles and Encore are sponsors of this event, as is Tina, so we can't thank you enough for your sponsorship as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina Young.
All right, thank you, Ken. And huge thanks to Charles Elk of Encore for carrying us through 2020. You know, Charles, I was hoping you'd have that pandemic fixed before my chair year started, but you know, we're on our way. So thank you everybody for being here. I wanted to just do a special thanks to our sponsors, Encore and Jackson Walker at the gold level, Atmos Energy, Burns and McDonnell, and my firm MarketWave at the silver level, and a supporting sponsor, Team Logic IT. Really appreciate the sponsorship support of the program. So the reason you're all here, you know, the economy of the great state of Texas is the second largest by GDP in the United States. And Texas continues to be a world leader in the energy sector, with energy just being a significant driver of our economy. And although this pandemic has hit everyone hard, I have faith and trust that Texas will recover and rise out of this in so many ways. And I think the energy sector has a lot of promise for our state and globally in the future. So I look forward to hearing our speakers today. Speaking of, I would like to introduce both Todd Staples and Rob Kaplan. So starting with Todd, and I think he'll make his way to the stage. Many of you know that Todd Staples has been our state's Texas Agriculture Commissioner, winning 2 statewide elections to that role. He also served with distinction in the Texas Senate and the House of Representatives. He is a proud Aggie and native Texan, as I am native Texan. And we're so proud to have your service to our state, Todd. Currently, Todd is the president of the Texas Oil and Gas Association. We call it TexOGA for short. But since 2014, he has been in that role. And he's been really instrumental in helping the state's oldest and largest trade association, TexOGA, to represent the full breadth of the Texas oil and gas industry. That this organization is a reliable and credible source for information. He has also implemented a multifaceted approach to educate voters and elected officials about the industry's contributions to our state and ensuring pro-energy policies happen in our state and beyond. Todd is from Palestine, right? And had started out with the Palestine City Council. He's been a successful businessman and rancher. And I think you might even split time now between Palestine and your business in Austin, right?
That's right, Tina.
Yeah.
Glad to be with you today. Appreciate the North Dallas Chamber and your leadership in building Texas.
Absolutely. And thanks for coming back, because I know we had you last year for the Energy Forum and had such a good response to that. In addition to Todd today, we have Rob Kaplan. We're really honored to have Rob, and he will come to the stage as well. But Mr. Kaplan has served as the 13th president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas since September of 2015. He represents the 11th Federal Reserve District on the Federal Open Market Committee formulating U.S. monetary policy, and oversees the 1,200 employees of the Dallas Fed. Kaplan was previously Martin Marshall Professor of Management Practice and a Senior Associate Dean at Harvard Business School. And prior to joining Harvard in 2006, Mr. Kaplan was Vice Chairman of the Goldman Sachs Group, with global responsibility for the firm's investment banking and investment management divisions. He became a partner in 1990 and served as co-chairman of the firm's partnership committee. He was also a member of the management committee. Mr. Kaplan has authored several books, and maybe some of you have read, one being What You Really Need to Lead: The Power of Thinking and Acting Like an Owner. I need to read that. Also, Mr. Kaplan has many philanthropic ventures, and he's chairman of Project ALS and co-chairman of the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, a global venture philanthropy firm that invests in developing nonprofit enterprises dedicated to addressing social issues. I have to get to the fact that Mr. Kaplan is University of Kansas graduate with Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, and also has a master's degree in business from Harvard Business School. Welcome, Rob Kaplan.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks for having me.
So I will step off stage. I believe, Rob, you're going to open us with some remarks, and then I think you and Todd will have a good conversation about the energy outlook.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Ken and Todd. Great to be here with you in the chamber. So let me just set the table. I'll take just a few minutes and talk broadly just about the macro outlook. 2020, the U.S. economy contracted about 2.5% if you take the fourth quarter of 2020 over the fourth quarter of 2019. And I don't need to tell you all this. Earlier in the year, it looked like we might have a much worse time in 2020 than we did. Second quarter GDP growth last year contracted annual 30%, but we rebounded in the third quarter and we grew at over 30% annualized. And we really started to grow in April with fits and starts based on the virus through most of the year. If I look ahead to 2021, we're right now still in the teeth of this pandemic, and we think the first quarter is going to be very challenging of 2021, but we still think because of fiscal support, we'll have positive GDP growth in the first quarter. And our forecast, our base case forecast of the Dallas Fed for the full year is that GDP growth will be in the neighborhood of 5% next year. We think the unemployment rate, which is right now 6.7%, will decline to something in the neighborhood of 4.5% by the end of the year. But underlying that forecast is the assumption that we'll gradually and steadily vaccinate more and more of the population as we head through the spring. It assumes that any new variants of the virus, it assumes that we'll be able to manage those and they'll be susceptible to the vaccines. And so we think based on that steady vaccination trend, that mobility and engagement will begin to gradually improve from where we are between now and June. And then we think beyond June, mobility and engagement will improve meaningfully in the third quarter and in the fourth quarter. We're not going to get back to where we were in January of 2020 this year, but we think we may well get back to quote unquote normal by the first quarter of 2022 in terms of mobility and engagement. But underline our forecast, if all that unfolds, as I just said, with a lot of uncertainty, we think we can grow at 5%. And depending on what additional fiscal actions are taken, we could see growth even greater than that. Now, let me make a couple of comments about what has made this pandemic so unusual. I mentioned that we had a 30% plus annualized decline in the second quarter of 2020. Normally, when you see a decline like that, you would see household incomes drop, you would see consumer spending drop, and you'd have the so-called recessionary effects of the downturn. We did not see that this time. Household income through this entire pandemic has remained relatively solid, and consumer spending has been solid. And we think that's primarily due to fiscal support, rapid and sizable fiscal support. And it's not that people haven't cut back their spending on airlines and restaurants and entertainment and hotels, no question about it, but they've shifted their spending to other sectors, home improvements, things they can do in general at home. Home prices have firmed meaningfully throughout the country. People have shifted their spending. And so that's been unusual. Fiscal support has been key to that. Another thing that's been unusual is the way it's affected different industries differently. And I don't need to tell you, if you work in a business where you can still deal with customers or clients remotely, and you can use technology to connect with your customers, you might have actually had a very good year in 2020. In the Great Recession, that wouldn't have been the case, but many businesses have had very, very solid years. On the other hand, if you're in a business that relies on person-to-person contact and you can't use technology to replace that, airlines are a classic example of that. You had a very rough 2020. Your business has not recovered. And if you're a small business like a restaurant or certain retail stores or other person-to-person businesses, you may be hanging by a thread right now and relying on fiscal support to make it through this. For workers, this is also broke very differently, and you've seen some people comment this is a K-shaped recovery. What they're referring to, if you have a college education or greater, it is far more likely in this pandemic that you're able to work remotely. It's far less likely that you've lost your job. And it's very possible that you've made it through this year, not without some trauma, but you've been able to keep your job, keep your income, and have a more manageable situation. If, on the other hand, you've got a high school education or less, it is far more likely you can't work remotely. You're in a job that requires you to come in person. You're a lot more likely to have lost your job. And you're a lot more likely to be relying on fiscal support and fiscal relief and unemployment benefits specifically to make ends meet. Just to give you an idea, if you got a college education right now, the statistics are your unemployment rate in this country, college or better, 3.7%. Okay. So, but if you've got high school education or less, you have a much more elevated unemployment rate. The last comment I'd make regarding the unusual trends is the way it's affected women, particularly women with children. In the Great Recession, we saw that the impact of the Great Recession affected men and women similarly. Not this time. If you're a woman with children, you have disproportionately left the workforce. The prime age participation rate for women with children has gone down a full 5.5 percentage points. That's a very substantial drop. And that's true whether you've got a college education or if you're low income, because you probably had to make the decision or agonizing decision to stay home with your kids because your kids may well not be in school. And access to daycare has been a real problem. And because of the pandemic, many daycares have had to shut down or restrict their operations. And for low income workers, they don't have financial access to daycare. And so I guess all this is to point out, as we come out of this pandemic, it's going to be critical that we take actions to help women re-enter the workforce, help make more available affordable daycare, get kids in school in person, hopefully by this fall. Those will all make a big difference. We also need to beef up skills training. And we've heard from junior college presidents throughout this district, they've disproportionately lost students, particularly Blacks and Hispanics, because they lost their job, their part-time job, or they don't have access to Wi-Fi. So as we come back, we're going to have to beef up skills training. And I think in those places in our state and our district where we don't have Wi-Fi, it's going to be critical to take actions to address that. Okay, so let me make a last comment about Texas, and I'll do this quickly, and about the oil and gas business, and then I'll turn to Todd and we can go a lot deeper. The recovery in Texas, what happened in 2020 and what we think is going to happen in 21 in Texas mirrors to a large extent what happened in the country. A couple of differences, though, that are worth noting. One is a substantial migration of people and firms from around the country to the state of Texas. Now, that migration isn't new. It's been, those at the chamber know it's been going on for years. The pandemic accelerated this migration, and that we've got people from Illinois, East Coast, West Coast, and I'm talking about people, but people bringing businesses and bringing jobs and bringing employees with them. That trend is accelerated dramatically. And GDP growth is growth in the workforce plus growth in productivity. Texas has a tailwind in growth in its workforce, and one of the big reasons is migration. And I would guess that migration is going to continue, and we can talk about the reasons why in the Q&A. Another thing that's been unusual, we'll get right to the subject of many of your businesses, oil and gas. On the one hand, I don't need to tell you, it's been an extremely challenging year in the oil and gas business. We had a supply shock and a demand shock, all in a short period of time. It turns out that oil and gas is probably in the neighborhood of 8% or a little bit less of the state's GDP, much lower percentage of GDP in this state than it was, say, 20 years ago. Mainly because the state has grown so much and the state has become so much more diversified. The population of Texas just in the last 10 years has gone from 22 million to pushing up 29 million. And what's come with that is diversification in tech sector, a whole range of other industries that have come here. And so while what's happened in the oil and gas business is clearly hurt jobs, we see a lot of consolidations, bankruptcies, restructurings. The state's been able to manage it. And I'd say the headline I would lastly comment on oil and gas, we think demand for oil and gas products globally is slowly recovering. And as the world and the United States recovers from the virus and mobility and engagement increase, you're going to see, and we're already seeing, more driving activity and more demand for energy. We think that U.S. production will be flat from 20 to 21. U.S. production growth declined last year from about 12.8 million barrels a day at the beginning of the year to about 10.8 million barrels a day at the end of the year. Probably doesn't surprise you. Even with the shut-ins and the shut-ins being reversed, we still had a big decline, but we think we'll be flattish this next year. And we think it will take probably to the first part of 2022 for global oil supply and demand to get into balance. While there's going to be a tremendous push for growth and alternatives, wind, solar, which Texas plays a big part in, and a big push for people who are in the oil business to be more sensitive and make improvements in greenhouse gas emissions, we still believe there's going to be substantial demand for oil and gas for decades to come. Just it will be a smaller and smaller percentage of global energy consumption. But country's going to need, and the world's going to need, a very strong oil and gas business for many years to come in Texas and in the United States. So that's a mouthful. Let me stop there and turn it over to Todd.
Well, Rob, we're all enjoying it. It's a pleasure to be with you again today. We appreciate you and your team. The work that you do and the information that you provide is tremendously beneficial to certainly our state and our nation. We're grateful for that. And the oil and gas industry is proud of the partnerships that we have with local communities, our state, our nation, and our world. And we are committed to a cleaner, stronger energy future. And you've given us a lot of things to think about, some good information for Q&A here. And for the audience, I know Rob does want to get into your questions as well. I see some of them coming in on the chat feature. I'm going to do my best to juggle those and try to consolidate some of those so that we get the themes that are being talked about. Good. I really am excited, Rob, that you're indicating that a 5% GDP growth next year and a declining unemployment rate. That's great news for all of us. We're excited about that. You know, I want to talk about energy, but because you led off with that, I think it's important to think about substantial progress in the terms of what the feds are doing, what the accommodative type policies that have been occurring. And substantial progress kind of needs to be defined. How would you measure that, determine how involved the Fed's going to be in making progress on unemployment and inflation? What are the triggers there?
Well, and by the way, just for the audience, the reason Todd uses this very specific term in the link, substantial further progress, because we've put benchmarks on the Fed funds rate. We did that in September. And on our asset purchases, we said we're going to buy 80 billion of treasuries and 40 billion of mortgage-backed securities every month, or at least that amount, until we see substantial further progress. And I guess, Todd, my answer would be, I'm going to be very careful. I don't want to even associate or think about associating a time frame with that. I think I'm going to be very careful as I monitor the economy this year to see how the economy unfolds, to be patient, and more importantly, not to be rigid or predetermined in judging when we actually meet that. And then privately at the FOMC, I'm sure we'll be having very enthusiastic debates. If we in fact do have a recovery, like I talked about, we'll have to see how it unfolds. We'll have very enthusiastic debates at the FOMC to figure out when we think we've reached those benchmarks. But I'll probably for today remain deliberately vague on it.
Well, so in thinking about that, though, the questions are coming in, Rob, and some things that we had thought about in preparation for this conversation. Look, we're in unprecedented times, so that calls for unprecedented actions. These actions, obviously, as you indicated in your opening remarks, are driving the markets. They're putting money and reinvesting, and activity is occurring. But what about the unintended consequences of these impacts? Where's this going to lead to the debt going? What do we need to be worried about, and when do these pressures start in action?
So I've been one who's been vocal about, while we're in the teeth of this pandemic, and until it's clear that we've weathered this pandemic, the Fed needs to be aggressive in using its tools. And I think we should be aggressive. After it's clear that we've weathered this pandemic and it's in the rearview mirror, which we're not out of the woods yet by a long shot, I do think it would be healthy to be weaning off some of these extraordinary measures. And there are always trade-offs when you take these aggressive actions and you're injecting substantial liquidity into the system and we're keeping rates very low. There can be unintended consequences, side effects. We monitor them carefully. I monitor them carefully, very cognizant of that. And it's always a trade-off. My trade-off judgment is while we're in the teeth of pandemic, we need to be aggressive, but I'm very cognizant to monitor these implications, whether it's financial stability, excesses and imbalances. And I would just say when we get to the point where we feel comfortable that substantial further progress has been made, I for one will think it'd be very important to be weaning off these extraordinary measures. And I think it'll be a lot healthier when we're able to do that. I just can't predict when that will be.
Well, that's understandable. We all want to know when interest rates are going to rise. We all want to know about the weakening of the dollar and the impacts that will occur. But we appreciate the close attention that you're paying to it. And kind of brings me to the Texas scene. You mentioned about the migration that's coming here, the influx, and you anticipate that will continue. If we know Tesla, Oracle, Hewlett Packard are all naming the relocations here. Samsung's, there's been news about them expanding significantly. What are the key decision points for these companies that makes them obviously want to do business here in the U.S., but Texas specific as well? Yeah.
So let me tell you, because I have these conversations literally every 2 or 3 days with someone that I've known for 25 years who's thinking about moving here. And some of the companies you mentioned. Central location, the tax regime here, 0 state local taxes is a big factor. Pro-business, easier to get a permit, easier to get a license, easier, I think their perception is to operate, and very welcoming environment. And some of the businesses I talk to complain that where they are, there's the tax issue, but they're also a little bit of the tone about how welcome do they feel and how pro-business or constructive are local authorities in helping them build their business. And I've been surprised, honestly, where people that I'm close to and I thought were pretty well wedded to where they lived are moving here and are telling me they're moving here. So Texas is doing something right in this regard. Now, let me give you a few cautions on that, though. Got to improve our education system. I know we're all well on our way. Early childhood literacy, skills training, improving secondary education, the healthcare system and access to healthcare for at-risk populations. These are all factors that are also cited by people as they think about, because they're looking for available workforce and they want to know that there's going to be a good flow of a healthy, educated workforce that's adaptable and can be productive. And so I think as long as we address those issues and continue to improve our infrastructure, I think we've got a heck of a chance to outperform the country for a long time. And I think the good news is those issues I talked about are in our control to address.
And I know policymakers are looking at those issues. There's been great strides that have been made, as you indicated. I also know from a macro sense, we are a low tax state, but for capital intensive businesses, our property tax burden is pretty heavy.
True. That's true.
So I know that there are economic development tools to manage those through the Chapter 312 and 313. And so I guess policymakers should look at those issues as well, I would assume, in your opinion, in order to make certain we're getting those capital intensive businesses as well to continue in Texas.
Yeah. And one of the nice things about the state is on these education issues, business leaders are at the forefront. I think one of many reasons why we were able to pass education reform 18 months ago, 20 months ago, is business leaders were vocal and they mobilized. And so we've got a very good ecosystem and relationship between businesses and government and local authorities, I think that can be very constructive.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head. The North Dallas Chamber here today is certainly bringing these business leaders together to have this kind of conversation to help guide our state. And you mentioned that our economy is diversified. Texas Oil and Gas is proud of the role that it still plays and continues to play. They have made tremendous investment of being sensitive to the concerns about our climate, and have, natural gas is the reason the United States air quality is actually cleaner today than it has been in a generation. And they have billions invested to continue to make progress there. We know that the last week, Rob, there's been executive orders. There's been conversations about canceling the Keystone Pipeline. There have been limitations imposed on domestic energy growth, a leasing of federal properties, and Texas is impacted by this to a large degree. But what do you think about the ramifications are on the ability of this industry to provide the energy needs? And I will say this, members of the Texas Oil and Gas Association are an all of the above energy approach. Our members recognize our energy portfolio is diversifying, also a part of bringing the lower emissions future forward and still using oil and gas. But I'm talking about the infrastructure that's necessary to deliver the power that fuels our daily lives. How will these decisions impact that readily available power that's needed as our economy gets back on track?
So let me start with the local, then I'll go to the national and some of the challenges. So to your point, we spend an enormous amount of time at the Dallas Fed. We have a big energy research group here, and we spend an enormous amount of time with leaders of the industry. And it's clear to me on the production and transmission side, the industry is doing, whether it's sequestration or a whole range of other activities that are expensive, and the way it deals with sand, water, other issues, it's doing a lot to try to make its production more greenhouse gas friendly and sensitive, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It can't do a lot about the product itself and the consumption of the product, and I'll come back to that. And I also note that a substantial number of participants in this industry are actively doing research on battery storage, wind, are investing in wind, solar, and are broadly defining their mandate where they can to be thinking more about energy of all types. So here's the challenge for the United States. And I mentioned this a little bit in the introduction. So it's clear we're on the path to aggressively develop alternatives. Okay. And we do a lot of work here to project the most aggressive paths. And what we see is, even if you take the most aggressive assumptions we can realistically make, when you go 20 or 30 years from now, there's still going to be substantial global and domestic demand for fossil fuels. And so the challenge for the country will be to transition, but it's going to be also critical to the country that you have a healthy oil and gas business. It's going to look different. My guess is there'll be fewer players. They'll be larger. Scale will be more important. Technology will be more important. Being able to afford the infrastructure investments in things like sequestration is extremely expensive. But you're going to need a healthy industry in the United States to fill demand. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're going through a transition and you get in a period where you've got a spike and prices at the pump, because a lot of our population is still very sensitive and reliant on fossil fuels. That'll be true for some extended period of time. So that's the challenge for the country, is how to go through the transition, but also, I believe, ensure that you've got a healthy industry, because it's going to take an extended period of time to successfully make this transition.
And I think that's the key, is that type of how much time it's going to take to make that transition. And I think we're having a little bit of technical issues on receiving your signal right now. We'll see if that gets a minute to clear up.
Okay. All right.
So we've lost you video, I think, momentarily, but I think we still have audio. So that's the key part right here.
Sorry about that.
No worries. This is our new world we're all living in, right? At least no children are running in the background through our presentation here.
That's right.
So in thinking about the energy transition, and that oil and gas is transitioning to a lower emissions future, you mentioned that. Are there things, we got a question here about the renewable energy and the job creation. Are there any impediments that could be in the way for the rise in renewables, or are there things that need to be done to facilitate that?
Well, so first of all, Texas got a big role to play, already is in solar and wind.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I know a number of companies here, and I go talk with go to R&D facilities by companies in the business. They're looking at intensively at battery storage, and not only operating firms, but financial firms that are doing this. So, but it's going to take a lot of capital. In the meantime, by the way, the traditional industry is having trouble attracting capital and is capital starved and is only able to operate, as you well know, out of cash flow, and has also agreed to return more cash flow. So the challenge will be, I'm convinced there'll be substantial jobs and plenty of GDP growth in the renewables business. It'll just be how to walk and chew gum at the same time and do both. But it's a big opportunity. And what are the impediments? I actually think you're going to see substantial investment because the alternative side doesn't have any trouble attracting capital. So I'm more worried. So I'm not worried about that. The worry will be, as we transition, will the traditional business be able to get enough capital and retain enough capital to drill enough to meet demand?
Well, that brings another question from the audience that's addressed to you and I both, but since I'm the moderator and get to present it, I'll let you take it up. But I guess the basis of the question is, you see a lot of companies that are making announcements, that are making statements. What's referenced here is GM's announcements that the passenger fleet will all, be all electric by 2035. Just your perspective on that, and how does that fit into our overall economic activity? And, can consumers afford this type of change when you think about the infrastructure that's necessary, the power to, if we have this kind of a transition?
So, and by the way, you're going to see a lot more of these announcements. And on your point about consumer affordability, a lot of it's going to do with battery production. We do a lot of work on this here. Battery production scale and the cost of a battery. Based on what I know, by the way, I think you're going to see greater and greater scale effects where, alternative powered cars, electric cars, they're going to get cheaper and cheaper to produce because you're going to get so much scale. But the battery is the key. So I'd be pretty optimistic that actually that transition will be possible. The issue will be, there are going to be lots of people in the country, even if GM is not selling a new car that's fossil fuel, many people are going to want to still own and operate a car they bought before that. And so we just have to keep that. These deadline dates for California or GM or others, there's the transition to that date. But that doesn't mean there still won't be a long tail for people who still operate a vehicle that they bought before. And then the question is, are there going to be actions taken to accelerate the transition to new vehicles? And we're just going to have to see.
It seems like, innovation and technology has to be the leader in how this transition occurs. I mean, we probably all, a few years ago, if we think about it, we've got an old TV sitting in our garage. When we put the new TV up, that's not as easy to do. When we think about our power sources, it's not as near as cost effective to do. And so allowing for these pioneering breakthroughs that has made the United States as competitive as it is, has got to lead us there. And having a rational conversation about this future, I think, is what is so important. It makes me think about the growth, Rob, that we've seen, the manufacturing that's come back to the United States because of, clean, affordable natural gas produced right in the U.S. That's been a big catalyst for that. As we think about this transition, what are your thoughts about maintaining our competitiveness with China, with India, and other countries where these manufacturing hubs we know went for years before they started coming back to the U.S.? Shouldn't that be a part of the conversation as well about where these jobs are going to be and where these products are going to be manufactured?
I'm sure it will be. And oh, by the way, I've spent a lot of time in China. I used to run the Asia business for my firm years ago before I moved back to the United States to run do the global business. And we go, and pre-pandemic, still go to China regularly. There's an enormous amount of money that's going to need to be spent in China to deal with the pollution problem they have. And for those who've been to Beijing or Shanghai, I don't need to explain any further. You know exactly what I'm talking about, where kids can't actually go outside and play during the day because of air quality. And it's having a big effect. And so they've got to actually, we have a big challenge here. They have an extremely large challenge and multi-trillion dollar, based on everything we've looked at, expenditure they're going to have to make to transition, or they're going to actually lose human capital themselves. So the whole world is dealing with this in different ways. The issue for us on competitiveness, to me, is still this issue of transition. Can we make these investments, make the transition? But I think you want to be very careful that as we're making the transition, you need a viable oil and gas industry too. Because again, if you get outages or spikes, or we have shortages, that's going to be very challenging to manage, not just for businesses, but I'm also thinking of consumers, individuals, and it will hurt the people most who are most at risk. So I'm confident this can be managed, but it will be a complicated process, and it's going to go over decades, not over years.
I think that's a good perspective for us as business leaders in Texas to think about that long term and to really establish that energy plan where we can allow for that all of the above approach, and to be that leader that I think Texas is positioned to be, that when we lead in wind and we lead in oil and gas, and the technology centers are here to perpetuate that. And I hope that's part of the conversation that we have with our federal government as we look at the types of policies that are occurring here. The retraining, I was with an employee yesterday and he said, I kind of like my job and I don't want to move to take another job. And so I know that's encouraging. When we think about jobs, you started out with talking a little bit about the need for skills training, our community colleges, the role that they play. We have a question from the audience here about that early childhood literacy that is so important. And the question is, are there any more specifics to be thinking about, improvements that would assist the industry at the secondary level and to ensure that local school districts continue to have a seat at the table in developing and implementing these solutions?
Yeah, so some of this needs to be done by the government and some of it can be done by businesses. And let me just talk through specifically. So the education reform of 18 months ago, talking about funding full day versus half day pre-K, and talked about teacher pay and teacher quality, which is a big issue, and an emphasis on literacy and other skills. So some of that was dealt with in education reform, but I believe in local communities, and we're seeing that here in Dallas. You're seeing local business leaders step up, and I'll do a quick plug for Commit is a great example of community leaders, all non-governmental, who are taking the lead, working with government and business to try to make these investments and make these improvements. So some of it's going to have to be done through nonprofits. And you see Superintendent Ina Osa, very sensitive to these issues. The whole ecosystem needs to be improved. And so of those of us on this call, there are things we can do to either donate to a nonprofit. I'm sure there's going to be a big conversation coming out of this pandemic on I mentioned childcare, daycare, particularly for at-risk groups that don't have access, where literacy is emphasized. I think that may well take private capital and donations from business leaders as much as it does involvement by the government. So those are some examples, but there's some great leaders and nonprofits in this state. This is what they do, and Commit, I'm a little biased, I'm on the board, is one example, but there are many others who really show great leadership, and they're not part of the government.
Well, thanks for your leadership in that space, because it is so important to continue to open that opportunity. And I think that's why we see the quality of life we do today is by rising that level of educational opportunity. Got another question here, Rob, that is really good, and it fits in with the conversation that we're having. Obviously, the Fed has options that it is implementing, but Congress also looks at tax and fiscal policy. And talk about for a minute the direction Congress might be looking at, and then how does that relate to what the Fed is doing?
So I thought it was very critical back in March, and we had lots of conversations, both sides of the aisle, how critical it was to move on the fiscal side and move it in size and quickly. And Congress responded, and that's for unemployment relief and programs like the PPP, for example, and other programs that allowed us to stabilize markets. Where we sit now, we're literally 9-12 months along. The thing I'm most sensitive to is, again, relief for those workers that have lost their jobs. Those workers, either they've lost their jobs, they're women with children that had to leave the workforce, they don't have enough to make ends meet, they're dependent on fiscal relief. And so that's still my number one sensitivity. There are other things being discussed, which I won't get in the middle of, about relief to state and local governments. I understand why, because there's a fiscal hole and states need the money for testing and vaccines and getting schools back reopened. But I'd say from where the number one at the top of the list is relief for those who need it most.
Very good. Thank you for that. As we're I'm watching the clock here so I don't get in trouble from Ken and get banned from the chamber meetings in the future. But as we think about the great information that you've given us and looking at 2021, you want to kind of think about or share with us key indicators, key things that we need to be looking at as business leaders as we're watching this economy move. What are those key indicators that we should be looking at, and then closing thoughts that you might have?
So I'll go through. I look at a whole range of things, and I have lots of conversations with businesses. So I'd say most businesses I talk to, by and large, are optimistic over the horizon. They think the next 3 months is going to be tough. But what am I looking at exactly? How many people are getting vaccinated every day? And there's been a lot of talk on getting to herd immunity. We're doing a lot of work here thinking, if we can keep going at 1 million people a day, plus or minus, and it's steady increase in vaccinations, and you start to see cases, but even more importantly, hospitalizations start to decline. I think, and I'm hopeful that will be as we go through the spring and into June, even though we won't be near herd immunity. If you start to see a fall off, the math starts to work better. I think you're going to start seeing people much more willing to go to a restaurant, get on an airplane, do a whole range of activity. And then all of a sudden, we've got plenty of savings out there. It'll be easier for people to get back to work who've lost their jobs. So the leading edge of this still for me, as we go through this, is vaccinations and cases and hospitalizations. And I watch that every day. And I think you're going to see other things where mobility engagement we track every day. You're going to see that start to improve. But I wouldn't expect it to go like this. The next 3 to 6 months, it's going to be a gradual improvement and slowing. But I think we'll get to a tipping point where you'll start to see much more meaningful improvement.
Well, Rob, as always, you give us a lot to think about. We appreciate you and your team. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from Rob Kaplan, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and we appreciate your conversation today.
Thank you,
and I'm sure we'll be back together soon. So, Ken, that kind of wraps up the time frame that you all gave us today. And I know we'd all love to hear from Rob for the next 2 hours, but people probably need to get this economy moving and get back to work.
That's for sure, Todd. And thank you so much. Jeff Kittner, our Chief Operating Officer, is going to close us out today. But before he does, I just want to personally thank Todd and Rob for being here and adding so much value to our chamber. I noticed that Rob has already dropped because he is moving pretty quickly. But Todd is calling in from his home office in Palestine, Texas, and we really appreciate you being here today with us, Todd. There's Rob again. So, and Rob, we can't thank you enough. Jeff and I were comparing notes. The two of you have actually addressed our chamber on 3 separate occasions each during the past year. And it really means a lot to us because of your great credibility in your respective fields. And we can't thank you enough for that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Kittner, our Chief Operating Officer, and he's going to close us out.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks again, Todd and Rob. Todd, you joked that you'd get in trouble for going over time. I think we really had 2 or 3 hours more worth of material that we could have gotten through, and there's no way you could ever get in any trouble with us on the chamber end. We love hearing from both of you all and really appreciate the time that you've taken to be here today. I want to also thank our sponsors, Encore, Jackson Walker, Atmos Energy, Burns McDonnell, and Team Logic IT. And of course, for Todd and to Rob, for both of you, we'll be making a donation in each of your names to the North Texas Food Bank, one of our nonprofit partners, at the end of our fiscal year, which is coming up in 2 days.